Hi everyone, my name is Richard Kigel. I wrote this book, Heavenly Tidings from the AFRIC MUSE, The Grace and Genius of Phyllis Wheatley, because America needs to know her story. When I tell people that I wrote this new biography of Phyllis Wheatley, I get a quizzical look, a raised eyebrow, and maybe, huh? Who? Well, that only shows why we need this new biography of Phyllis Wheatley. So here's a look at the life and legacy of Phyllis Wheatley. And helping to tell the story is my friend Dania Manderson, an English teacher in the Bronx, and my amazing videographer, Renee Simone. So, who was Phyllis Wheatley? She was kidnapped when she was a child from Africa and came to America as a slave. By the time she turned 20, Phyllis Wheatley became the most famous African in the world. She was the first person of African descent and only the second woman to publish a book in America. During the War for Independence, she played a significant role that should earn her a place among the founding mothers and fathers of our nation. When this frail little girl set foot in Boston on July 11, 1761, Phyllis Wheatley became the only name we know among the untold millions who suffered the horrors of the Middle Passage, whose arrival was documented.
Where was Phyllis born? And where did she spend the first years of her life? It is impossible to identify exactly where her journey from Africa began. In a poem published in 1774, when she was 21, Phyllis wrote longingly of what may be a memory of her African homeland. She named the land of her birth as Gambia and expressed her desire to return. It was the only time she ever mentioned the place where she came from.
In fair description are thy powers displayed. In artless grottos, amid the sylvan shade, charmed with thy paintings, how my blossom burns, and pleasing Gambia on my soul returns.
One day in July 1761, a new shipment of African slaves had just arrived in Boston. An advertisement from a slave trader caught the eye of Mrs. Susanna Wheatley, 53-year-old wife of the wealthy Boston businessman John Wheatley.
Aunt Wheatley was in want of a domestic, a Wheatley relative wrote. She went on board to purchase. In looking through the ship's company of living freight, her attention was drawn to the child, which at once enlisted her sympathies. Owing to the frailty of the child, she procured her for a trifle, as the captain had fears of her dropping off his hands without emolument by death.
Once she arrived at the Wheatley home, the first order of business for the new girl was to receive her new name. Susanna Wheatley called her Phyllis. That was the name of the ship that carried her from Africa to Boston. The Wheatleys lived in a mansion on the northeast corner of King Street and Mackerel Lane. In today's Boston, that would be State and Kilby Streets. It was one of the finest dwellings in town. It was located in the heart of Boston. Most of what we know about Phyllis Wheatley came from Susanna Wheatley's great-grandniece, Margaretta Matilda Odell, whose biography of Phyllis appeared in the 1834 edition of Phyllis Wheatley's poems. It was written 50 years after her death, and it was the only serious effort by a member of the Wheatley family to share what they knew of the personal history of this extraordinary woman who came to their house as a child.
Not long after Phyllis Wheatley arrived in Boston, the Wheatley family began noticing something startling about their new slave girl. She soon gave indication of uncommon intelligence, Odell wrote, and was frequently seen endeavoring to make letters upon the wall with a piece of chalk or charcoal. Her master, John Wheatley, said, as to her writing, her own curiosity led her to it. By seeing others use the pen, she learned to write, said Susanna Wheatley, son-in-law, Reverend John Laffer.
John Wheatley offered his own testimony to confirm his slave's exceptional abilities. This is what he wrote. Phyllis was brought from Africa to America in the year 1761, between 7 and 8 years of age, without any assistance from school education, and by only what she was taught in the family. She, in 16 months' time from her arrival, attained the English language to which she was an utter stranger before, to such a degree as to read the most difficult parts of the sacred writings to the great astonishment of all who heard her.
To their great credit, the Wheatleys established an atmosphere in their home that would support and encourage their gifted young slave as she progressed in reading and writing. Phyllis was a precocious child, and the Wheatleys offered her an extraordinary opportunity to develop her talents and interests.
Few Bostonians had the luxury of light in their bedrooms, and only the most fortunate had the comfort of warmth during those brutal New England winters. Phyllis had both. Despite her legal status as the property of the Wheatleys, she had considerable freedom to pursue her own inspirations in her writing. She was allowed and even encouraged to follow the leading of her own genius, said Odell. But nothing was forced upon her, nothing suggested or placed before her as a lure. Her literary efforts were altogether the natural workings of her own mind.
One day, two gentlemen came to visit the Wheatley home. Over dinner, they had told a harrowing tale. They were sailing from Nantucket to Boston when they were overtaken by a ferocious storm and narrowly escaped death. Phyllis was there, probably serving dinner, as the men relived their life and death drama. She must have followed every detail, because later on she went up to her room, took out a pen, and wrote a poem to memorialize the event. Susanna Wheatley was so impressed by Phyllis's writing that she submitted the poem to a local newspaper. The poem appeared in the Newport Mercury on December 21st, 1767. At the age of 14, Phyllis Wheatley became a published poet.
Where do they go? Where would be their abode? With supreme and independent God, to haven their souls with eager rapture soar. Enjoy the bliss of him they would adore. Blessed soul would seize the day while light doth shine, to guide his steps, to trace the mark divine.
By the time Phyllis saw her first poem published in 1767, she had been writing poetry for at least 2 years. Her first poem was On the Death of the Reverend Dr. Sewell When Sick in 1765. Phyllis was 12 when she composed this heartfelt elegy to honor a man she considered her spiritual mentor and guide. Reverend John Sewell was pastor of the Old South Congregational Church for 56 years. Phyllis was drawn to the church on Sundays, walking several blocks from the Wheatleys' home to attend worship services. Following custom, Phyllis sat in the balcony with other slaves and free blacks. There, she experienced her first yearnings for Christian fellowship. It was there that she was baptized on August 18, 1771, when she was 18.
She wrote On Virtue in 1766, when she was 13. The poem shows the growing depth of her spiritual inquiry and her ease in blending classical and Christian themes. Wheatley scholars regard On Virtue as one of her finest poems.
On Virtue, 1766. O thou bright jewel, I am my aim to strive, to comprehend thee. Thine own words declare, wisdom is higher than a fool can reach. I cease to wonder and no more attempt thine height to explore or fathom thy profound.
The teenager became something of a curiosity. The Wheatley's African slave girl could do things no one had ever seen before. Not only could the girl read and write, but she was creating exquisite poetry. Skeptics and the curious came to the Wheatley mansion to see for themselves. Visitors to the Wheatley home would be obliged by Mrs. Wheatley to listen to her little black genius recite her original poems. Phyllis was trotted out as some sort of public entertainment. She became an exotic curiosity in fashionable Boston.
Phyllis met some of the most learned men of Boston, and she had the opportunity to talk about literature and religion. Many of them gave her books and helped her study the great literary works of her time. Her poetry shows that Phyllis was well versed in the scriptures of the Old and New Testament and Greek mythology, as well as Shakespeare, Horace, Virgil, Ovid, Terence, Milton, and her favorite, Alexander Pope. So what was Phyllis Wheatley like? She produced no autobiography. She barely left any record of her thinking, no personal account of her feelings, concerns, hopes, or plans, and her letters offer only the slightest opening to her inner life. We have only her poems that shine a light on the deepest places of her soul.
Contemporaries of Phyllis Wheatley said, "She was very gentle-tempered, extremely affectionate, humble, modest, unassuming, and dignified. She displayed an amiable disposition, innocence, and purity of heart." A family friend wrote, "I'll delineate her in few words: humble, serene, graceful, luminous, and ethereal."
A constant factor in her life was her delicate constitution and frail health. Phyllis suffered from chronic asthma and experienced attacks that were severely debilitating and lasted for months at a time. Her condition was so serious that Mrs. Wheatley sent her away from the city to recuperate in the peace and quiet of the countryside. Phyllis wrote to her friend,
I am at present indisposed by cold, and since my arrival have been visited by my asthma. I have been in a very poor state of health at the past winter and spring, and now reside in the country for the benefit of its more wholesome air.
Sometime toward the end of 1771, a group of intelligent, passionate, and deeply religious young women met to discuss what was called feminine topics. Phyllis Wheatley was there, along with her friend and tutor Mary Wheatley Lathrop, daughter of the man who owned her. These kinds of gatherings were popular at the time. Women and their friends and family got together to discuss news, culture, philosophy, and religion.
This particular gathering in Boston, Phyllis picked up the thread of an idea that emerged from the conversation and transformed it into exquisite literary art. What followed was a gem. Phyllis dedicated On Recollection to the young woman who issued the challenge.
The poem was published in 1772 in London and 2 Boston newspapers in 1773. On Recollection marvels at the sacred power of memory, how it brings deeds long past back to life.
The acts of long departed years by thee, recovered in dew overrang we see. Thy power the long forgotten calls from night, that sweetly plays before the fantasy's sight.
The poet trains her penetrating gains within, reflecting on how the mysterious workings of mind and memory inspire her poetry.
Mean in our nocturnal visions pours the ample treasure of her secret stores, and in the pumped images displayed to the high-raptured poet gives her aid. Through the unbounded regions of the mind, diffusing light celestial and refined.
On Imagination is probably her finest work. Today it is one of her most frequently anthologized poems. Lines from On Imagination are etched in stone on the pedestal of the Phyllis Wheatley statue at the Boston Women's Memorial. The young slave poet finds her freedom in imagination as a joyful, expansive, and limitless expression of mind that allows her to escape all earthly bond.
Imagination, who can sing thy force, or who describe the swiftness of any course? Soaring through the air to find the bright abode, thy embryo palace of the thundering God. Thy various works, imperial queen, we see how bright their forms, how decked with pomp by thee. Thy wondrous acts, impetuous order stand, and all attest how potent in thine hand. Now here, now there, the roving fancy files, till some loved object strikes with her wondering eyes, whose silken feathers all the senses bind, and soft captivity involves the mind.
Thoughts on the Works of Providence is one of her most profoundly spiritual poems. She discovers that the secret to nature's universe is the divine power of boundless love.
Infinite love, where'er we turn our eyes, appears this envy, captured once supplies. This most is heard in nature's constant voice. This makes the morn and thus eve rejoice. To him, whose works arrayed with merry shine, what songs would rise, how constant, how divine.
The British Parliament passed the Stamp Act on March 22, 1765. It was scheduled to take effect on November 1st. Citizens were required to buy a stamp for almost anything written on paper. Newspapers, handbills, pamphlets, legal documents, deeds, licenses, college degrees, even playing cards. The Stamp Act would affect nearly everyone in the colonies. That summer, the summer of 1765, Boston erupted in protest. From the safety of her house on King Street, Phyllis Wheatley watched the town of Boston exploding around her. Demonstrators rallied past the Wheatley mansion on King Street to the townhouse where the royal governor had his headquarters. Crowds destroyed buildings and even ripped down the house of the lieutenant governor.
Then, in May 1766, Boston got news that Parliament had repealed the hated Stamp Act. The festivities started almost immediately. Church bells rang all over town. Phyllis Wheatley knew the anguish the Stamp Act had brought to her town. Parliament's change of heart moved her to write a poem for the occasion. In her poem, To the King's Most Excellent Majesty, Phyllis spoke for all of Boston as she praised the king for his gracious action.
May George, beloved by all nations round, live the heaven's choice, constant blessings crowned, miss the remembrance of thy favors past. The meanest peasants most admire the last.
Phyllis added an asterisk after the word last with a note of explanation: the repeal of the Stamp Act. The last line of the poem carries a pointed message. Phyllis reminds the king that it is within his powers to bless all his subjects with liberty. And she means all his subjects, including African slaves.
Great God, direct and guard him from on high, and from his head let every evil fly, and may each climb with equal gladness see. A monarch's smile can set his subjects free.
She was keenly aware of the inflammatory situation that was swirling around her. She describes the explosive unrest in the colonies in allegorical terms. Her grand theme was freedom, an ideal she saw as the most significant force in human affairs. The poet made an eloquent case that the freedom sought by white Americans, this liberation from metaphorical slavery under the British rule, also applies to Africans suffering under the burdens of actual slavery.
In her allegory, the mother country, Great Britain, is depicted as a certain lady who had an only son, the American colonies.
She condemns British policies, comparing them to a mother who punishes her son despite his innocence. As the cruelties of Parliament broke the hearts of the colonists, so this fictional mother made her own child weep. The young poet captured the frustration and anguish she saw in Boston, the fury directed at the British government. She shows the colonies begging for relief to a scornful and dismissive British response.
By many scourges she his ungodliness tried, until at length the best infant cried. He wept Britannia, turned the senseless air, at last awakened by maternal fear. Why weeps Americus? Why weeps my child? Thus spake Britannia, thus being enmild. My dear mamma, said he, shall I repeat? Then prostrate fell at her maternal feet.
She concludes with an appeal for reconciliation, hoping that mother and son will come together to bring a new prosperity to the colonies, as well as to the British Empire.
Throughout 1769, the Boston merchants' boycott of all trade with Great Britain remained in force. Any merchant caught violating the boycott would be shamed before the entire community. Demonstrators would gather to enforce the boycott and taunted anyone who violated it. On February 22, 1770, one of those warning signs was posted on the door to the shop of Phillis Wheatley. He was a Tory who refused to participate in the boycott. A crowd gathered in front of his store and began harassing all the customers. A fellow Tory named Ebenezer Richardson tried to defend him, but the crowd turned on him, then battered him with dirt, stones, and sticks, and chased him all the way back to his house. As the crowd shouted and threw rocks at his house, he grabbed his musket and fired out the window. At that moment, 11-year-old Christopher Sider was bending down to pick up a rock he intended to throw when he was hit. The boy fell badly wounded. Bystanders quickly carried him to safety, but at 9 o'clock that night, he died.
The killing of a child unnerved the poet, and she soon put her thoughts on paper. She wrote on the death of Mr. Snyder, murdered by Richardson, to show the cosmic significance in this tragedy. Wheatley gives the boy the sacred honor of becoming the first martyr for the cause.
It was the first poem of the Revolution. Following the death of Christopher Sider, Boston was seething. For the past 17 months, the people of Boston had put up with a humiliating military occupation. Angry British troops patrolled the streets, bitterly resenting their harsh treatment by the townspeople who treated them with the vilest scorn at every opportunity. It came to a head on Monday, March 5th, 1770. Phyllis was certainly at home in the Wheatley mansion on the corner of King Street and Mackerel Lane, just 2 blocks from the townhouse, where British soldiers faced the fury of a Boston crowd. There was no way she could avoid the alarm bells, the shouting, the mobs, the chaos that ruled the night. Surely she heard the gunfire that left 4 dead in the street and watched people scattering in horror as fleeing crowds ran past her house.
It was the deadliest crisis in Boston history. For days afterward, most of the shops shut down in mourning. Now these 4 deaths, a 5th victim who was wounded that night died later, were more than the city could bear. The funeral on March 8, 1770, was a civic event like nothing Boston had ever seen. News accounts indicated that the funeral procession passed her home on King Street and noted that nearly every resident of Boston was there that day. That means Phyllis was probably among the 10 or 12,000 Bostonians present at the Granary Burial Ground to watch the 4 bodies laid to rest alongside the recently buried Christopher Sider. On March 12, 1770, Phyllis's poem on the Boston Massacre appeared in the Boston Evening Post.
On the affray in King Street, on the evening of 5th of March, with fire enwrapped, surcharged with sudden death, lo, the poised tube convolves its fatal breath. The flying ball, with heaven-directed force, rids the spirit of fallen course. Lost to their view, surviving friends may mourn, yet on thy pile shall flames celestial burn. Long as in freedom's cause the wise contend, dare to your unity shall fame extend, while to the world the lettered stone shall tell how Caldwell, Attucks, Gray, and Maverick fell.
Shortly after the massacre, Boston resident John Adams declared that the 5th of March, 1770, ought to be an eternal warning to this nation. On that night, the foundation of American independence was laid. In the spring of 1772, Susanna Wheatley devised her plan to collect Phyllis's poems and publish them in a book. Mrs. Wheatley had Phyllis go through her writings and choose her best poems and they wrote a book proposal. No Boston publisher would agree to print the book because they did not get enough subscribers. Because of entrenched ideas of white supremacy, many white people did not believe that a black person was capable of producing such fine work.
Susanna Wheatley came up with a new strategy. She and Phyllis collected the signatures of 18 of Boston's most prominent citizens, attesting to her writing skill. The document was signed by the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the leading clergy, scholars, and merchants of Boston. Most of them knew Phyllis personally and had ample evidence of her abilities. One of those who signed the attestation was founding father John Hancock, later to become the first president of the Continental Congress and the first to sign the Declaration of Independence. John Hancock was a business client of John Wheatley's, who visited the Wheatley home often and knew Phyllis personally. When she could not find a publisher in Boston, Mrs. Wheatley looked toward London. She knew from her own contacts with religious figures in Britain that London offered a greater marketing opportunity than Boston. It was the capital of the British Empire. A wealthy British religious leader, the Countess of Huntingdon, agreed to serve as Phyllis's benefactor and to finance the publication of the book. The Countess requested that Phyllis provide a picture of herself for the book. So Phyllis sat for her portrait. Mrs. Wheatley hired Scipio Moorhead, a black artist and slave to one of their neighbors, to paint the picture. Phyllis wrote a poem to SM, a young African painter, on seeing his works to honor a fellow artist.
The portrait was revolutionary. A mass-produced image of an African-born woman participating in high culture. Nobody had ever heard of such a thing before. It was a direct challenge to the dominant belief in white European supremacy. For the average person in the American colonies, the existence of a slave poet like Phillis Wheatley was a disorienting notion. This idea was so strange, it seemed unfathomable. Suddenly, white people had to consider new ways of thinking about these Africans in America, and for many, this radical new idea brought resistance and denial.
This is how Phillis Wheatley introduced herself to America. She could hardly have chosen a more striking image. A dignified young woman of intelligence and learning, though still a slave, a woman who was clearly and unmistakably black. One of her most famous poems is a bold celebration of the universal desire for freedom. To the Right Honorable William Earl of Dartmouth makes the forceful declaration that the glorious cause of the aggrieved colonists, their liberation from bondage, was her cause as well. In this poem, Phillis Wheatley became the voice for an emerging nation.
She dares to associate the iconic image of an iron chain with a heinous act of enslavement, a clear reference to the horror she herself experienced, along with millions of her fellow Africans. She makes the case that these iron chains of wanton tyranny also enslave her white neighbors and fellow Americans.
Hail happy day, when smiling like the morn, fair freedom rose New England to adorn. No more America in mournful strain, of wrongs and grievances unjust complain. No longer shalt thou dread the iron chain, with wanton tyranny, with lawless hand, had made and with it meant enslaved the land.
She challenges Dartmouth and all Americans to face the self-evident proposition that people with a conscience, those who know the difference between right and wrong and possess the human ability to empathize, they are the people who can understand her position on slavery and freedom. It requires only a feeling heart.
Should you, my lord, while you pursue my song, wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung, whence flow these wishes for the common good, by feeling hearts alone best understood.
One striking passage marks the poem as one of the most extraordinary in the Wheatley canon. Phyllis shares the anguish she knew as a young girl, suffering the fate of a barbarous kidnapping and the pain of cruel separation from her family. It was the only time Phillis Wheatley addressed the devastating emotional toll of slavery. In lines carved into the pedestal under her statue at the Boston Women's Memorial, she describes her ordeal.
I, young in life, by seemingly cruel fate, was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breast. Steeled was that soul, and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his babe beloved.
By presenting her own case, Phillis Wheatley compels the reader to look differently into the hearts of those devastated by slavery. The poet forces a moral question into the American consciousness, so that no one will ever again experience such tyranny.
Such my case, and can I then but pray? Others may never feel tyrannic sway.
On May 10, 1773, Phillis Wheatley, accompanied by Nathaniel Wheatley, her owner's son, sailed to London to arrange for the publication of her book. Her departure was covered by newspapers throughout New England, in Boston, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, and New York.
Newspapers described her as the extraordinary Negro poetess, the ingenious Negro poet, or the extraordinary poetic genius. Phyllis's trip to London and the upcoming publication of her book there became something of a media event in colonial America and Britain. The young writer had become a celebrity. Henry Louis Gates says that Phillis Wheatley was the Oprah Winfrey of her time.
Phillis Wheatley's time in London was one of the most thoroughly documented periods of her life. The reason we have more details about her London visit than almost anything else about her is because Phyllis gave us a full report in her own words. About a month after she returned to Boston, Phyllis wrote letters to two of her friends telling them all about her London experience.
The friends I found there among the nobility of gentry, their benevolent conduct towards me, the unexpected and the unmerited civility of compliance with which I was treated all, fills me with astonishment. I can scarcely realize it. I was received in England with such kindness, compliance, and so many marks of esteem, and real friendship astonishes me on the reflection.
For the 20-year-old poet, enslaved as a child, her arrival in London could not come at a more fortuitous moment. In London, she was legally free as long as she stayed there.
While she was in London, she could go wherever she wanted with whomever she pleased. There was no restrictions on her movements. That included spending time with Britain's most prominent abolitionists. This suggests that Nathaniel Wheatley, her owner's son, who accompanied her to London, no longer regarded her as personal property, subject to his supervision and control. Clearly, by this time, he thought of her as a free woman.
The most important consequence of her trip to London was that at some point during that time, she earned her freedom. On October 18, 1773, she wrote, "Since my return to America, my master has, at the desire of my friends in England, given me my freedom." We do not know the exact circumstances that prompted her freedom, but we can conclude the obvious, that Phillis Wheatley, who was then the most famous poet in the colonies, with admirers on 2 continents, actually wrote her way to freedom. On September 13, 1773, Phillis Wheatley landed back in Boston. Her return to America was widely noted by the press. 8 local and regional newspapers announced her arrival as the celebrated young Negro poetess, or Phyllis, the extraordinary poetical genius. Since she was free in London, the Wheatleys had no legal basis to compel her to return to America. The fact that she did return to Boston suggests that she leveraged her legal status as a free woman in London to ensure that the Wheatleys would grant her freedom in exchange for coming back to live in the Wheatley home.
Phyllis had a strong support system in Boston. Her faith community at the Old South Church, a network of mentors among the Boston elite, and a circle of friends. Susanna Wheatley made her feel accepted as part of the family. She was the only maternal figure Phyllis ever knew. Susanna Wheatley served as de facto literary agent for Phyllis, arranging publication of her poems throughout New England. A special bond grew between owner and slave. Phyllis ate of her bread and drank of her cup, and was to her as a daughter, Odell wrote. Phyllis herself described her relationship to Susanna Wheatley.
I was a poor little outcast, a stranger when she took me in. Not only into her house, but I presently became a sharer in her most tender affections. I was treated by her more like a child than her servant.
In December 1773, Phyllis knew that her books had rolled off the presses in London and were on their way to Boston. In a letter to her friend on October 18, Phyllis wrote that she expected delivery of her books soon.
I expect my books, which are published in London, in Captain Hall, who will be here in, I believe, 8 or 10 days.
Captain Hall and her books did arrive, not in 8 or 10 days, but nearly 6 weeks later. On Sunday morning, November 28, 1773, the Dartmouth under Captain Hall anchored in Boston Harbor. Unfortunately for Phyllis, she was not able to retrieve her books. That night, the town of Boston placed the ship under 24-hour armed guard to make sure no merchandise was removed. Phyllis Wheatley's books were held on the ship, along with some nefarious cargo, 114 chests of East India tea.
News broke in November 1773 that 7 ships carrying East India Company tea were sailing for the colonies.
The Dartmouth was the first tea ship to land, and the town watch immediately took over the ship to make sure no cargo was offloaded. The good citizens of Boston began clamoring for the items they had ordered and paid for other than the tea, like linens and other fabrics, wine, china, and furniture. One Bostonian especially, eager to pick up her long-awaited merchandise, was Phyllis Wheatley. Her books were on that boat.
On December 1st, the town leaders authorized Captain Hall to unload all of his cargo except the tea, under the watchful eyes of the town guard. Over the next 10 days, dockhands removed all sorts of merchandise from the ship, including the barrel containing Phyllis Wheatley's books. But they left 114 chests of tea behind. On the night of December 17, 1773, a group of Boston men disguised as Mohawks boarded the 3 tea ships, cut the barrels open, and dumped the tea into Boston Harbor. Phyllis managed to take possession of her books just days before the Patriots' daring raid that came to be known as the Boston Tea Party.
Poetry and tea, traveling side by side, made strange companions in the annals of American history. Only 12 years earlier, Phyllis Wheatley had lived the nightmare of her own ocean voyage as human cargo, one among tens of millions, hoarded like animals in unimaginable misery. Now her creative offspring, her poems, was making the same transatlantic journey. The words of Phyllis Wheatley, celebrated through centuries as a shining testament to the power of human creativity, became a poignant witness to the glorious gifts lost in the abomination of slavery.
The tea was another story. Despised as a symbol of oppression, it never reached American soil. It was trashed and drowned in the sea. Sublime poetry and scorned tea crossing the Atlantic together on the Dartmouth forever links Phyllis Wheatley to one of the most iconic moments in American history. Now that Phyllis had her books, the marketing campaign already underway in London could begin in Boston. The first American advertisement for her book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, appeared in the Boston Gazette on January 24, 1774.
There was one significant change from her London advertisement. The author was no longer described as a Negro servant to John Wheatley. Instead, she was Phyllis Wheatley, a Negro girl. She was now a free woman.
Soon after her book came out in January 1774, it became something of a hot item. By the end of the year, Wheatley's book was also on sale in New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Canada.
Throughout the winter of 1773 to 1774, even as she worked to promote her book, Phyllis served as caregiver and nurse to the dying Susanna Wheatley. Finally, on March 3, 1774, Mrs. Wheatley died at the age of 65. Phyllis was at the bedside during the death watch. Odell describes Phyllis gently ministering to Mrs. Wheatley as she took her last breath. It was her mournful duty to close the eyes of her indulgent and unwearied friend. The loss hit Phyllis deeply. As a sensitive and compassionate woman, Phyllis could not help sharing her profound sorrow with her closest friends.
I have lately met with a great trial in death of my mistress. Let us imagine the loss of a parent, sister, or brother. The tenderness of all these were united in her. The word is a severe schoolmaster, for her frowns are less dangerous than its smiles and flatteries, and it is a difficult task to keep in the path of wisdom.
In February 1774, Phyllis Wheatley had been a free woman for about 6 months. She read a printed version of a sermon by her friend, the Reverend Samson Occam, the Mohegan Indian and Christian minister who often stayed at the Wheatley home when he preached in Boston.
Phyllis was so inspired by his sermon that she was moved to write a response. It became her most direct condemnation of slavery. She made her point with penetrating intellect and moral authority. Not only was slavery unjust and immoral, it was ridiculous and nonsensical. She stands on the authority of divine law to speak for all humankind as she issues her most damning rebuke of the atrocity of slavery. Addressing slaveholders directly, she calls them modern Egyptians.
In every human breast of God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. And by the leave of modern Egyptians, I will assert, the same principle lives in us.
She concludes with one last parting shot, mocking their arguments with understated scorn. Phyllis essentially asks, "What's wrong with this picture?"
How well the cry for liberty and the reverse disposition for the exercise of oppressive power over others agree. I humbly think it does not require the penetration of a philosopher to determine.
Reverend Occam was so impressed by the letter that he arranged to have it published in the Connecticut Gazette on March 11, 1774. Soon the letter gained a wider audience and was reprinted in newspapers throughout New England. When news of the Boston Tea Party reached London, the British were outraged. Parliament passed a series of new laws designed to chasten their unruly colony in Massachusetts Bay. In America, they were known as the Intolerable Acts. The Boston Port Act would close Boston Harbor on June 1st, 1774. All shipping and much of the region's economic activity would come to a halt until the town officials reimbursed the East India Company for its losses. By early 1775, the British military presence in Boston was growing. A steady flow of reinforcements arrived by sea, expanding the force to more than 4,000 men. Boston became an occupied city. Disheartened citizens of Boston began leaving in a panic, some with only the clothes on their backs. The Wheatleys joined the exodus from Boston, abandoning their King Street mansion for Providence, Rhode Island, and Phyllis went with them.
It was from Providence that Phyllis wrote a letter to her friend Ober Tanner on February 14, 1776. It was discovered in 2005. Until then, only 19 Wheatley letters were known to exist. This handwritten letter, signed by Phyllis Wheatley, sold for a record-setting $253,000. The New York Times reported that it was the highest ever paid at auction for a letter written by an African American and for a letter by a woman.
Even I, a mere spectator, am in anxious suspense concerning the fortune of this unnatural civil contest. Possibly the ambition and thirst of dominion in some is designed as punishment of the national views of others. Thou, it bears the appearance of greater barbarity than that of uncivilized part of mankind.
With two massive armies facing each other surrounding the city of Boston, the largest military force North America had ever seen, a terrible cataclysm seemed inevitable. Phyllis ended her letter with a prayer, dedicating their perilous position to a higher authority.
Let us leave the event to him whose wisdom alone can bring good out of evil, and he is infinitely superior to all craftiness of the enemies of this seemingly devoted country.
In July 1775, nearly 3 months after the occupation of Boston, the city received a jolt of good news. The Second Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, voted to form a military force. And as commander of the new Continental Army, they chose George Washington.
Phyllis Wheatley was in Providence, Rhode Island in the fall of 1775 when she sat down to write probably the most consequential poem of her career. Her latest inspiration was a tribute to the new Generalissimo of the armies of North America, His Excellency George Washington. It was a bold step for the confident young poet. She took it upon herself to become the voice of Boston, welcoming the general to the fight, showering him with accolades, crowning him with glory befitting the savior of a city. On behalf of her community, Phyllis Wheatley wanted the general to know that the hopes of Boston were riding on his shoulders. The poem and letter were dated October 26, 1775, from Providence.
Sir, I have taken the freedom to address Your Excellency in the enclosed poem an entreat of acceptance. Thou I am not insensible of its inaccuracies. Your being appointed by the Grand Continental Congress to be Generalissimo of the armies of North America, together with your fame of your virtues, excites sensations not easy to suppress. Your generosity, therefore, I presume will pardon the attempt. Wishing Your Excellency all possible success in the great cause you are so generously engaged in, I am Your Excellency's most obedient humble servant, Phyllis Wheatley. To His Excellency General Washington. Fixed are those eyes of nations on the scales, for in their hopes Columbia's arm prevails. Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine, with gold unfading, Washington be thine.
General Washington had his aides send the letter and the poem to the Virginia Gazette, who published them on March 20th, 1776. Then, General Washington took a startling and unprecedented step. On February 28, 1776, the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, a Virginia aristocrat and slave owner, sat down to write what was the most extraordinary letter of his career. General Washington composed a personal message to Phyllis Wheatley, thanking her for her letter and, in particular, the poem. According to Washington biographer Joseph Ellis, it was the only occasion in his correspondence when he directly addressed a slave.
Then Washington offered Phyllis a startling proposal. If you should ever come to Cambridge or near headquarters, I shall be happy to see a person so favored by the Muses, and to whom nature has been so liberal and beneficent in her dispensations. His closing was warm and gracious. I am, with great respect, your obedient, humble servant. It was the first time in his life, perhaps the only time, that George Washington ever gave a black person the unusual distinction of an invitation to pay him a social visit.
The only report we have on Wheatley's visit to Washington was from a journalist who wrote this report after visiting the house himself and talking to the owner. This is what he wrote. Washington invited her to visit him at Cambridge, which she did a few days before the British evacuated Boston. She passed half an hour with the Commander-in-Chief, from whom and his officers she received marked attention. Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer Ron Chernow offers the most accurate assessment we have. Chernow writes, Washington appears to have received Phyllis Wheatley at his Cambridge headquarters in March with a very courteous reception. With her literary tribute to George Washington, Phyllis Wheatley marched directly into the thick of the war effort, supporting the Patriots' cause with the best weapon at her disposal, her soaring verses.
The poem offered something new, an allegorical innovation credited to Phillis Wheatley. She appropriated the Greek-influenced name Columbia, land of Columbus, then commonly used by the British press to refer to the British colonies in America. The mother country was called Britannia. Wheatley reimagined the name Columbia to give it an entirely new and richer meaning. The poet saw Columbia as a vivid visual character, a woman endowed with mythical celestial qualities. The poet saw Columbia as a vivid visual character, a woman endowed with mythical celestial qualities. In her artistic vision, Columbia became a goddess with divine authority, a powerful warrior wrapped in heavenly light who came to lead the fight for freedom. With this novel touch, Phillis Wheatley gave the first personification of America as a nation.
Celestial core, enthroned in realms of light, Columbia's scenes of glorious toils are right. The goddess comes, she moves divinely fair, olive and laurel binds her golden hair. Wherever shines this native of skies, unnumbered charms and recent graces rise.
It was an unprecedented image at the time, but soon the Wheatley depiction of Columbia became an iconic figure. Lady Columbia, portrayed as a shining goddess draped in classical garments, sometimes carrying an American flag and sometimes the torch of liberty, became the leading symbol for America. Miss Columbia came to represent the spirit of the country and American ideal. About the time of World War II, Miss Columbia fell out of favor as a stand-in for America, replaced by the Statue of Liberty and Uncle Sam. But for a century and a half after Phillis Wheatley's Miss Columbia appeared as a virtuous goddess in a flowing robe, the image had a glorious run as the symbol of the land of liberty. It was perhaps Phillis Wheatley's most enduring gift to the American spirit.
Sometime in the fall of 1779, Phyllis decided to concentrate on the business of poetry. Phillis Wheatley was facing some hard times. She was no longer an exotic African child prodigy. She was a free Black woman in her mid-20s with no marketable skills. There were no prominent white patrons to sponsor, no more wealthy intellects to invite her to tea and to celebrate her talent. She was on her own.
Phyllis had been writing continually since her first book was published in 1773. 6 years later, she had dozens of new poems for her second book. She chose 32 previously unpublished poems to include in her book, along with her highly regarded tribute to George Washington, plus 13 of her letters.
Phyllis remained determined to show her growth as a poet with greater depth and maturity. Her second collection of writings would be her best yet. This book would show the self-assured artistry of an accomplished poet, a writer of sophistication and polish in promoting the grand theme of freedom for all. Her second book would be very different from her first. Many poems in her 1773 book had been written when she was a teenager and still a legal slave. In stark contrast, nearly all poems in her 1779 collection were written by a free woman in her 20s. This would be a collection of entirely new material. She wanted to showcase her literary gifts at their finest.
1779 was not a good time for poetry and literature. The war for independence was heating up, and the economic climate was growing more desperate. Phyllis's 1979 book was never published. Tragically, of the 33 poems she listed in her 1779 book proposal, only 7 have survived. The remaining 26 poems have been lost to history. The year 1784 was pivotal in American history. Peace negotiations with Britain, which began after the British surrender at Yorktown in 1781, finally concluded in the Treaty of Paris on September 3, 1783. When Congress ratified the Treaty of Paris in January 1784, American independence became a reality. Phyllis Wheatley was probably among the Boston spectators at the ceremony in February 1784 that hailed the signing of the Treaty of Peace. For Phyllis Wheatley and for Boston and for all Americans, the turmoil that they had suffered for nearly 20 years was now over. After Boston celebrated the Treaty of Paris, certifying a new, free, and independent nation, Phyllis Wheatley wrote her most triumphal ode to America. In February 1784, her poem Liberty and Peace was published as a 4-page pamphlet.
The poem begins with a shout of joy. The exultant poet proclaims the good news. The long, bloody war was finally over. The most cherished aim of the patriots had been realized. She honors the success of the American Revolution by recognizing that the real victory belongs to the power of peace. Light has come and destroyed the darkness.
The sending peace and power of war confounds. From every tongue celestial, peace resounds. As for the east, illustrious king of day, with rising radiance drives the shades away. So freedom comes, arrayed with charms divine, and in her train commerce and plenty shine.
The last lines of Liberty and Peace call up the image of a flaming torch, the sacred light of freedom. That golden ray touches every part of the nation, bathing its people in divine glory.
Auspicious haven shall fill the favoring gales, where'er Columbia spreads her swelling sails. To every realm shall peace her charms display, and heavenly freedom spread her golden ray.
Wheatley has captured, perhaps for the first time in poetry, America's mission to the rest of the world. Even if Phyllis Wheatley had not written any other poem, Liberty and Peace would merit serious consideration as one of the greatest literary achievements of this young nation. Celebrating the dawn of a new era, Liberty and Peace was Phyllis Wheatley's last known poem. Phyllis was alone. Her support system had completely vanished. During this time, she lost 2 of the 3 children born to her. With her husband out of the picture, Phyllis had to find a way to support herself and her one remaining child. So she turned to what she did best. She placed an advertisement for a second volume of her writings in the September 1784 issue of the Boston Magazine. Phyllis Wheatley's final push for her second book of poems went nowhere. 3 months after the advertisement for her book appeared, Phyllis Wheatley was dead. A funeral notice ran in Boston on December 8, 1784.
Phyllis Wheatley lived for 31 years. She lived in Africa for her first 7 years, and in America for her next 24. For 12 of those years, she was a slave. She wrote poetry for 19 years and established herself as a widely respected poet on 2 continents. 46 of her poems were published during her lifetime, and 10 more appeared after her death. Henry Louis Gates called Phyllis Wheatley the most famous African on the face of the earth.
The story of Phyllis Wheatley is one of a gifted young poet, struggling against the forces of deeply embedded racism, determined to contribute to the culture of her world. She remained proud of her roots, referring to herself as your ventress Afric, or an Ethiop. In her own words, Phyllis Wheatley characterized her poetry as heavenly tidings from the AFRIC MUSE. She was a Middle Passage survivor.
She arrived in this country as a slave, unable to read, write, or speak a word of English, and she became the first African American and only the second woman to publish a book in America.
Her own literary gifts, creativity, and intelligence in the face of virulent white supremacy forced the culture around her to acknowledge her humanity.
She was regarded as a genius in her time, and despite persistent efforts to discredit the intellectual capabilities of people of African descent, genius remains part of her legacy.
Through her poetry and letters, she was an eloquent advocate for freedom and a supporter of the Patriots' cause.
Her reimagined portrait of Lady Columbia as a goddess of liberty gave us the first personification of the American spirit.
She personally knew at least 5 of our founding fathers, all of whom praised her work.
Three years before the Declaration of Independence, her decision to return to Boston from London, where she was free, made Phillis Wheatley the first person of African descent to claim an African American identity.
The first shipment of her books arrived from London on the same ship as the Hated Tea, forever linking Phillis Wheatley to one of the most iconic moments in American history.
Phillis Wheatley can now be considered among the founding mothers and fathers of our nation and the unofficial poet laureate of the American Revolution.